So my name again is Ruth Bansovich. I work here at the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion. And I'm just going to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Ernest Lucas, who is an honorary research fellow in theology and religious studies at Bristol University. Until recently, he was the vice principal and tutor in biblical studies at Bristol Baptist College. He is one of those dual qualified people. He has a PhD in chemistry and another PhD in Oriental studies, with studies in theology and becoming ordained in the Baptist Church in between. And Ernest is going to talk to us today about Genesis 1.
Thank you, Ruth, for that introduction. You may wonder why I have the privilege, and I do see it as a privilege, of two sessions this week to talk about a creation account, which is part of the sacred text of two particular faith communities, namely Jews and Christians. What about all the other faith communities? Well, you can ask Hilary afterwards why she made that decision, but there are four reasons why I think it's important to share this with you. One of them is a historical one. You heard from Peter Harrison today that it's a historical fact that modern science as we know it arose and, as he said, persisted and consolidated in Western Europe. And that was at a time when the dominant cultural tradition was Judeo-Christian tradition. And Francis Bacon, for instance, whom he mentioned, talked about the importance of every man, he did use the word man, I'm sure he meant every person, should be well read in God's two books, by which he meant the scriptures and the nature. And from then on, there was a dialogue about how do we relate our understanding of the world that's growing as modern science grows, how do we relate that to the written book of Scripture? And so there was always been debate about how we relate it to Genesis. Secondly, why I think it's important, is that I think you might learn something if you're from a different faith community, because each faith community has its own sacred texts. And for instance, for me, reading a few years ago, Nidal Grayson's book, if I've got his surname correctly, it's there in the bookshop, Israel's Quantum Question, I found constant resonances about the debates within Islam about how they relate science to the Quran with what I had experienced as a Christian, or what I do experience as a Christian, about debates about relating science to Christianity. Then there is the fact that I find, I hope it's not, you don't take this in the wrong kind of way, but as I talk to scientists, many scientists, I'm talking particularly about Christians who are scientists, are not up to speed with what's been happening in biblical studies. And their approach to Scripture is, I would say, a very old hat one. And I hope you might learn something from seeing some worked, if you like, how modern Old Testament scholars grapple with Scripture. Finally, picking up the last question in the previous session, how do we open a dialogue with religious fundamentalists? Well, I come from a fairly fundamentalist religious tradition that I grew up with. And having worked in the States in the 1970s, and meeting young earth creationists then, to whom I was quite sympathetic at that time, I've had a dialogue for the last 40 years or more with a particular group of fundamentalist Christians. And about 25 years ago, I decided I would stop debating with young earth creationists about science, because that wasn't the issue. The issue was how they understood the Bible, because for them, that was the fundamentals. And so I began to work with a different language. One reason I wrote that book, which in its later incarnations became Can We Believe Genesis Today? And the responses I've had from people who've read that book have led me to feel that, yes, there is something productive about approaching the issue of how to interpret your sacred text. That gets where people itch more than discussing the science does. Okay, so let's bring us into what we're going to talk about this afternoon. Now, when people talk about science in the Bible, they immediately begin to think of Genesis chapters 1, 2 and 3. That's not where I want to begin, because the Hebrew Bible, Christian Old Testament, and I stress I am talking as a Christian Old Testament scholar, I am no expert in Jewish study of Scripture, nor in Islam, so I'm coming at this as a Christian. That the Hebrew Bible, the Christian Old Testament, contains texts about creation in other places other than the opening chapters of Genesis. And I think it's helpful and productive to start with some of those other creation texts. For instance, Psalm 74. It's a prayer for national deliverance after a calamitous military defeat. And the psalmist puts his hope in the God of Israel because he is the one who is the creator and therefore has the power to deliver his people. I mean, who else could do it but the creator? But he talks about creation in a rather unusual way. You divided the sea by your might, you broke the heads of the sea monsters in the waters, you crushed the heads of Leviathan, you gave him as food for the creatures of the wilderness, and yes, it is talking about creation, because he goes on to say, you split open springs and brooks, you dried overflowing streams, yours is the day, yours also the night, you've established the heavenly lights and the sun, you've fixed the boundaries of the earth, you've made summer and winter. Well, in that second slide there, you've got strong echoes of Genesis 1. Here he's talking about the Creator God, and that's the one to whom he's appealing for help. And then Psalm 89. It's another plea for deliverance after the king in the line of David has suffered some serious defeat. Again, the God of Israel is appealed to as the powerful Creator to do something about this situation. And the psalmist says, you ruled the raging of the sea, when its waves rise, you still them, you crushed Rahab like a carcass, you scattered your enemies with a mighty arm, the heavens are yours, the earth also is yours, the world and all that's in it, you founded them, the north and the south, you created them. Again, it's talking about creation, but about in terms of some kind of conflict, a conflict which involves raging waters and some monstrous beings called Leviathan and Rahab. And then Job. Job 26 is part of a poem extolling the greatness of the God of Israel. And part of that greatness is that he is the creator. So the poet says, by his power, he, that is God, stilled the sea. By his understanding, he shattered Rahab. By his wind, the heavens were made fair. His hand pierced the fleeing serpent. Again, Rahab. And doing something with the sea comes out. Just notice that phrase, the fleeing serpent, because that's going to be important and significant in a few moments. And then moving to a prophet, Isaiah. And in this situation, it's a word of encouragement to the Judeans who are now in exile in Babylon. And it assures them that their God, the Creator, will bring about a new exodus. Not from Egypt this time, but from exile in Babylon. And so the prophet speaks, awake, awake, put on strength, O arm of the Lord, awake as in days of old, the generations of long ago. Was it not you who cut Rahab in pieces, that pierced the dragon? Was it not you that dried up the sea, the waters of the great deep? All that it echoes Genesis 1, but talking about waters being dried up, he moves into the Exodus from Egypt, who made the depths of the sea a way for the redeemed to pass over. So the creation of the world is linked with the creation of Israel through the Exodus. And this God can do another creative act. He can bring the Judeans out of Babylon and bring them back to Judea and to Jerusalem. Well, here are references to the God of Israel, the Creator, stilling the sea, destroying opponents who are described as sea monsters, serpents, dragons. Two of them are named, Rahab and Leviathan. It's all rather mysterious until archaeology came to the aid of scholars interested in the Hebrew Bible. And this happened when, in the 1930s, French archaeologists began to excavate a site on the coast of northern Syria, a site nowadays known as Ras Shamra. They found that they were excavating a Canaanite city known from Babylonian records under the name of Ugarit, a city that was an important trade centre, linking the Mesopotamia with the wider world of Mediterranean. So it's an important cultural link and trade link city. It was destroyed in about 1200 BC and never rebuilt. So the site had not been touched for 3,000 years. And amongst their excavations, they found these sort of clay tablets, written in cuneiform script, but written in a previously unknown language. It wasn't Akkadian, which is what you might expect with cuneiform script, but as very soon it became clear it was not a syllabic language, but an alphabetic language, and unusually, quite quickly, it was deciphered and found to be, what they call it now Ugaritic, obviously, but found to be a relative of early Hebrew. Canaanite language closely related to early Hebrew. Now, amongst these texts were religious texts, which contained stories about the Canaanite gods. Indeed, some of those gods mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. And for instance, Baal, the god Baal. And there are stories about Baal's battle with the sea and with a particular monster. You smote Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, and made an end of the wriggling serpent, the tyrant with 7 heads. So there we've got Leviathan. I told you to note that phrase, the fleeing serpent, from the book of Job. And in the Psalm 74, Leviathan is said to have many heads. You crush the heads, they're not numbered. But here it's numbered as 7 heads. But something else. When we look at the verse in Isaiah, now this is looking forward, the prophet says, on that day, the day of the Lord, an eschatological concept in the theology of ancient Israel, on that day the Lord with his cruel and great and strong sword will punish Leviathan the fleeing serpent, Leviathan the twisting serpent, and he will kill the dragon in the sea. Nicholas Wyatt, who's a leading Ugaritic scholar, makes the point that when you allow for translation differences between Ugaritic and Hebrew, the way Leviathan is described by Isaiah and the way it's described in Ugaritic text are virtually identical. But Isaiah, where do you date Isaiah? Well, you're talking about something like 800 years later. Those Canaanite texts have been in the ground for 800 years before Isaiah wrote this piece of poetry. So what's going on here? Well, this is talking about creation in terms of a conflict with raging waters in which there are monsters and dragons and so on. Well, there's no doubt, I think, that behind this is a widely known, throughout the Near East, the Fertile Crescent, widely known way of thinking about creation, best known to us now through this Babylonian epic, Enuma Elish, which is about creation, in which the creator god, now in the Babylonian account this is the god Marduk, because Marduk is the national god of Babylon, Marduk has to do battle with the forces of chaos. I mean, creation, in their understanding, is bringing order out of chaos. So you start with chaos. And chaos is depicted as raging waters with hideous monsters in it. And Marduk has to overcome these hideous monsters in order to bring order and create the world as an ordered entity. He does this by defeating the leader of the monsters, Tiamat, who's described as, in various ways, as a dragon of some sort. When he's defeated Tiamat, he slices her in half, like filleting a fish, and with one half makes the circle of the earth, and with the other half makes the dome of the heaven. And that is creation. If you look at that more carefully, that's in fact depicting, it's a cylinder seal, but there Tiamat is more like a serpent than perhaps a dragon, but there are different ways of visualizing her. Now, what do we draw from this? Now, I said I'm speaking from a particularly Christian perspective, and I would say what this shows us is that the Hebrew poets used the imagery about creation that was part of the culture in which they lived to say that it was their God, the God of Israel, not some other god such as Marduk or Baal, who was the creator. And they do that because deeply rooted cultural imagery is a very powerful way of communicating. If you like, it's their version of having sound bites. You can say a lot with a picture without using many words. And you sort of hit people below the belt by doing that. It doesn't mean that they believed in these other gods. In fact, it's a polemic against these other gods, saying, no, it's not Marduk, it's not Baal is the creator, it's the God of Israel. And I call this the use of the principle of incarnation, and here I'm drawing a specific Christian doctrine and understanding. Because for Christians, the supreme revelation of God is in a human person, Jesus Christ, and John, in his Gospel, puts it this way theologically: the Word, the message from God, the revelation from God, became flesh. Of course, in Latin, and it was a Latin Bible that for 1,000 years was the main Bible in Western Europe, carne, flesh, so incarnation. The Word became flesh and lived among us. So God's revelation came in a specific person, in a specific gender, in a specific ethnic group, with a specific historical and cultural setting, and so on. And so the revelation comes in an incarnated form. And to understand it fully, we need to understand all we can about that cultural setting in which it comes. I live in South Wales. As I drive around in my part of South Wales, I see lots of sheep. There are many people who say that there are more sheep than people in Wales. But if as a Christian pastor and teacher, I want to talk about some of, say, Jesus' parable about the Good Shepherd or the lost sheep, or Jesus' talk about himself as the Good Shepherd in John chapter 10, I have to make the point that shepherding techniques in the Near East in the time of Jesus are very different from shepherding techniques in 21st century South Wales. Otherwise you miss some of the things that Jesus is saying, or may misunderstand them. You have to do some cultural transposition in order to understand what is being said. Now, I'm saying that we must do that with every part of the Bible. But God's message has always come incarnated in particular and ethnic, cultural, historical, linguistic, and indeed literary context, because we are dealing with a text. It's true of the Hebrew prophets. They each lived in a particular historical moment in the history of Israel, and they have different emphases, and they express things in different ways according to their cultural context and indeed their own personality. You can read it in English translation, you can see Jeremiah's very different personality from Ezekiel or from Isaiah and so on. The laws of the Old Testament, the Mosaic Law, comes to an agricultural ancient Near Eastern economy and is incarnated in that kind of economy. You just can't pick that up and apply it to 21st century technological, industrial economy. So you've always got to do this cultural transposition, and we have to take that into account when reading and interpreting the Bible. In one sense that's difficult, in another sense it's not all that difficult. I find talking to ordinary church members in Christian churches, it doesn't take them long to pick up on this, because we do it all the time. With everything we read in our own culture, we read different kinds of literature, and we are used to unpacking it to some degree. And there are some basic questions that you can ask. I think we do this intuitively to a large degree, but when you're dealing with a controversial text like the opening of Genesis, it's good to be a bit more systematic and to ask the questions and think about them. What kind of language is being used in this particular text? We're all aware, I'm sure, of the difference between poetry and prose, and most languages have that kind of distinction between poetry and prose, but what many people I find are not aware of is there are many different kinds of prose. In particular, there's literal prose, and as scientists you particularly tend to be used to that kind of prose, but there are many forms of figurative prose. You need to be aware of that. It expresses truth in a different way from literal prose. My wife is a physicist, and for 20 years was a physics teacher in secondary schools in England and Wales. She came home from school one afternoon and didn't look very happy, and I said, "What's wrong, dear? You don't look very happy." And she said, "Oh, I've been banging my head against the brick wall all afternoon." I wouldn't look for the first aid box. But she enjoys gardening. If she came in from the garden not looking very happy, and I said, Why are you not very happy, dear? What's wrong? Oh, I banged my head against the brick wall. I would look for the first aid. One case, it's using figurative expression. The other case, the expression is using literally. We need to ask this question about everything we read. What kind of language is being used here? And there are clues to that. But what kind of literature is it that I am reading? There are different kinds of literature. I'm sorry if there are any French people here to remind you that a few weeks ago it was the 200th anniversary of the Battle of Waterloo. I haven't been interested in history, I haven't been interested in military history. One of my ancestors fought at the Battle of Waterloo. He was just a trooper in the 3rd Dragoon Guards, not a very important person. But Bernard Cornwell is a novelist who writes historical novels, and he has a series of them about Richard Sharp, who is a fictional rifleman fighting through the Peninsular War and up to Waterloo and indeed a bit beyond. And one of the questions about the Battle of Waterloo, it's not a particularly important question, but it was to some people in the battle, was who shot, wounded the Prince of Orange? The Prince of Orange was the Crown Prince of the Low Countries, the Netherlands. Because he was a royal personage, he had to be given senior command under Wellington. The trouble was he was a rather rash young man. He was known as Slim Billy. But the trouble is, if you fought under him, you had a higher chance of dying. And indeed, he destroyed 2 battalions of Allied troops during the Battle of Waterloo by his rash decisions. But partly through the battle, at one point in the battle, he was shot and had to leave the field, and that probably contributed to Wellington's success. Well, in his novel, Sharp's Waterloo, Cornwell answers who shot him. It was Richard Sharp, this fictional rifleman, because he was so fed up with this chap's... I mean, some of his friends had died because of the wrong decisions this man had made on the battlefield. But, not surprisingly, this year, Bernard Cornwell wrote a history book about the Battle of Waterloo. It's a very good read, well worth reading. Now, in that, he is quite honest about the fact we don't really know who shot the Prince of Orange. Probably was a French sniper. But you see, in one case, you've got a piece of literature that's a historical novel, which is written for entertainment primarily, and the writer can use freedom of imagination, and he's developing characters and so on, and he's got freedom to make his own, to say things that are not clearly necessarily true. There's no evidence. In the other case, he's writing, trying to write as a historian, and so he's honest about the lack of evidence. Because that's not written for entertainment, that's written for information. Because he's a good novelist, it's an entertaining read, in fact, but it attempts to be historically accurate. So we need to know what sort of literature we are dealing with, to know what kind of questions are worth asking of it, and what kind of answers we're likely to get. You don't turn to a historical novel to get historical answers about some of the questions that historians have been debating for decades. Well, what's the expected audience of this piece of literature? Because that's important too. If I'm talking to a group of teenagers in a church youth group, I'll talk about science and religion in a different way from which I will with this audience here. A good communicator will make sure that what they say is relevant to their audience and the needs of their audience. What's the purpose of the text? Well, to some degree, answering the first 3 questions may lead you to an answer to the question what the purpose of the text is. Why is it written? What kind of information is it seeking to convey? And then, what relevant extra biblical knowledge is there? What knowledge from outside this text might help me to understand it rightly? And I'm going to suggest to you one of the important areas of knowledge that's helpful here is knowing something about the ancient Near East and its creation stories. That's important for understanding this text, because it's a text from the ancient Near East. And also knowing something about science may also well be helpful. So we're going to turn to Genesis 1 in particular, and go through those questions. Well, I'm going to do it by looking at some of the answers being given to these questions in the Christian tradition, and indeed answers given before we had what we might call the debate about science and faith. They go back before Galileo, for a start. So this is John Calvin, one of the Protestant reformers, writing in the middle of the 16th century, a commentary on Genesis, and talking about Genesis 1, and indeed verse 16, he makes the point that the kind of language that's been used here is, as he puts it, the language of the ordinary person. He uses the common person. And he says, Moses wrote in popular style things which, without instruction, all ordinary persons, endued with common sense, are able to understand. He's saying this is the language, in our terms, the language of the supermarket, not the language of the university lecture theatre that's been used here. Why did he say that? Because it's the verse that talks about, and God created the two great lights. And it has got the there in the Hebrew. English translations often leave that out. Now, there was some debate in Calvin's day, those who held to the Ptolemaic, which was the dominant understanding of the structure of what we now call the solar system. They had an idea about the relative distance of Saturn and the Moon from the Earth, and in the light of the apparent brightness of Saturn and the Moon, and what Ptolemy implied about their relative distance, they decided that Saturn must either be very much brighter or very much bigger than the Moon for them to have the relative brightnesses that they do. Now, is that a problem when Moses, in Genesis 1, talks about the two great lights? Because Ptolemy was suggesting that Saturn was either bigger or brighter or both than the Moon. No, says Calvin, because it's not talking about that. It's talking about the world as people, ordinary people, see it. Those two great lights that you see, one to rule the day, one to rule the night. They're created by our God. It's a theological statement. It's not an astronomical statement. And so, another way of putting it is this is the language of appearance. It's about the way things seem to be, which is not necessarily the way they really are. And so he says nothing is here treated of, in Genesis, but the visible form of the world. He who had learned astronomy and other recondite arts lived elsewhere. So in the light of the kind of language and the purpose of this text, says Calvin, don't ask it astronomical scientific questions. That's not what it's about. So if you ask those kind of questions, you're likely to get a stupid answer. I mean, if God had wanted to say something astronomically relevant, he might have said God created a great light and a great mirror, because there is a good Hebrew word for mirror, and we know the moon's a reflector. It didn't. It says two great lights, using the term that would be used of self-luminous bodies. And indeed, there's a verse in Job 13:18 which tells us how the ancient Hebrews thought about the world, because there Elihu says to Job, can you, like God, stretch out the heavens like a molten mirror, hard as a molten mirror? Well, mirrors in those days were not made of glass, because they hadn't learned how to silver glass. They were made out of polished metal. And so the stretching out, the verb that's used there implies beating out a sheet of metal. So, and the comment in 1 verse 8 is about God making a rakiach. And the Hebrew word rakiach implies something that's solid and made out of metal. And that's why the early Jewish translators, translating the Torah into Greek about 250 years before Christ, used the Greek word stereoma for rakiach, because that means something solid and hard. And that's why in the King James version of the English translation, 1611, the translators talk about a firmament, a word that clearly means something firm, something solid. So the picture is of a solid heaven. Calvin is saying, well, that's just the way things looked to them. And it's not trying to convey astronomy, it's trying to convey theology. What kind of literature? Well, here I'm going to jump back to a very early Christian scholar, Origen, writing, as you see, early in the 3rd century, talking about Genesis 1, says, what person of intelligence, I ask, will consider as a reasonable statement that the first, the second, and the third day, in which there is said to be both morning and evening, existed without sun, moon, and stars. They're created on day 4 in Genesis 1. And the first day was even without a heaven, because that's created on day 2. That's the rakiach. I don't think anyone would doubt that these are figurative expressions which indicate certain mysteries through a semblance of history. So he's saying, just look at the text. It doesn't make sense if you take it literally. And that's an important clue, an important pointer, he says, that this is a figurative text. It's not to be, it might seem to be history, a semblance of history, but it's a figurative text which conveys what he called mysteries. He means theology, conveying theology. So I don't know much about Jewish interpretation, but I think Maimonides says this in his work, in which he refers to his guide to the perplexed, in that he says that to take Genesis 1 to 3 literally leads to absurdity. Thank you. But he said if you understand it symbolically, it contains wonderful wisdom. And so there's a similarity in the reading here between at least one Jewish tradition and one Christian tradition. And there's a way of looking at Genesis 1 that I've traced back to the 18th century. It may go back earlier, but it looks at it as an account, a figurative account of a worker doing a week's work. And we start with the fact that at the beginning, the earth is shapeless and empty, tohu vavohu, shapeless and empty, and the first 3 days are spent shaping it by acts of separation. So light is separated from darkness, the waters are separated, those above the Rakiach and those below the Rakiach, and we get separation of sea and land and plants on the land. So now we've got something that's been shaped, but it's like, if you like, some empty filing cabinet drawers. What's going to go into the drawers? Well, you get specific creatures that relate to the shape. So this is why you get the creation of the day of the light just postponed to day 4, because now they fill the shape of light and darkness. And then day 5, you get the creation of the birds that are said to fly across the face of the Rakiach, so they are linked to the Rakiach, and you get the fishes that are in the waters below the Rakiach. And then, of course, day 6, you get creation of animals and humans to live on the earth and to eat the plants that are there. And on the final day, of course, you get rest. So the picture is of a worker doing a good week's work. End of each day, he says, that was a great day's work. At the end, he says, that was a smashing week's work. So God is depicted in this way as a worker, to tell us it's an ordered and planned creation, and to give a pattern of work and rest for us as humans. And the word that's used there for good in Hebrew, tov, certainly in biblical Hebrew, its primary meaning is fit for purpose. And so this worker is saying, this is what I intended doing. It fits the purpose I had for it, which is to give a suitable environment for humans made in my image to live. So what's the audience? Well, I think this is probably the only question that has a more or less indisputable answer. It was originally written for ancient Hebrews. But that's important, because what Professor John Walton, who's not only an expert in the Hebrew Bible, but an expert in ancient Near Eastern literature and thought, says of the evidence from the whole of the Hebrew Bible, that that's the ancient Hebrews, believed the sky was material, solid enough to support the residence of the deity who lives above the Rakiach, and to hold back the waters, because there's waters above it, that come through windows in heaven, remember, in the Hebrew Bible, to give you the rain, the hail, and the snow. They come through windows in the Rakiach. And in these ways, and in many others, they thought about the cosmos in much the same way that anyone in the ancient world thought, and not like anyone thinks today. And then he goes on to say, and God did not think it important to revise their thinking. In contrast, it makes perfect sense that God communicated his revelation to his immediate audience in terms they understood. God could communicate what he desired regardless of one's cosmic geography. So this is incarnation of the message. God incarnates a theology about creation in terms of the understanding of the cosmos that the ancient Hebrews had. He didn't attempt to revise the cosmology. I mean, how could he? In what way would he revise it? Would he revise it in terms of medieval Ptolemaic cosmology or 21st century Big Bang cosmology? And who knows what cosmology will be in the 23rd century? So that's not the point. The cosmology is just the cultural clothing for the theology. And what we need to get at, stop being hung up about the cosmology and science in that sense, but get at the theology. And in fact, I said we now know quite a lot about ancient understandings and ways of just talking about creation from the ancient Near East, from the cultural world of the ancient Hebrews. And two scholars, Clifford and Collins, have done a comparison of the ancient Near Eastern creation stories and what they call the modern scientific creation story, and they make 4 points. That the ancient Near Eastern writers imagine and present divine creation on the model of human making. That's why I said Genesis 1 seems to depict God as a worker, doing a week's work. That's a model of human making that's used. And indeed, one of the verbs used in Genesis 1 is the verb asa, which is a common word to use for human making. And it's used alongside the word bara, to create. Whereas scientists regard creation as the impersonal action of physical forces. It's a very different way of thinking about creation. But neither of them is invalid. It's just different ways of thinking about it for different purposes. Ancient Near Eastern accounts focus on the emergence of human society. So Genesis 1 ends with the creation of humans in the image and likeness of God, and their role being to subdue and to have dominion over the world. So it focuses on the nature and role of humans, whereas scientists are primarily concerned about the emergence of the physical world. And then thirdly, ancient Near Eastern texts present creation as a drama, as a story. And it's a very selective story, a very selective drama. Whereas science is an account of the unfolding of impersonal, law-governed process. And then this is very important, the criterion of truth for ancient Near Eastern accounts is functional. Does the story enable me to cope with some aspect of life now? And by looking at the other ancient Near Eastern stories and the context in which they're told, which is often to do with healings or other issues, they're asking questions like, who are we and why are we here, and how's it going to help me to live a good life in the world today? That's what they're interested in. Whereas for scientists, the criterion is, does it explain all the scientific data satisfactorily? So it's a very different way of thinking about, being interested in creation. We shouldn't try and make one story answer the questions of another story, or try and telescope them together. Professor Walton makes an important point when he says people in the ancient world believed that something existed not by virtue of its material properties, but by virtue of having a function in an ordered system, that is, in relation to society and culture. Their primary interest is not where did matter come from. Their primary interest is where did the order come from, and what does that have to say to us about how we live in this world today? That's what they're interested in. And interestingly, if you think about those first 3 days of giving shape, of giving order, what functional systems are they dealing with? Day 1, light and dark. That's a time system. The most fundamental time system in human experience is the 24-hour rotation of the Earth. And then, of course, we then get the lunar month, and then we get the seasons from the Earth going round the sun. So God has set up this functional system of time which governs human life on this planet. That's what it's saying. Secondly, you have the rakia, with waters above it, which I said come down through windows. This is the weather system, vital for how we live in this planet. And so we're told the weather system has been made by our God, and it's good for his purpose. It's good, it's fit for purpose. And then on day 3, you have the dry land with plants on it and fruit-bearing trees. This is about the agricultural system. So it is saying God has created these functional systems which are fit for purpose for humans to live and do what God wants them to do. That's what the story is about. Well, that leads us to the final question, what is the purpose? And I want to suggest to you the right way to think about Genesis 1 is that its purpose is to present a true theological understanding of the nature and purpose of creation in contrast to the pagan ideas with which the Hebrews were having to deal in their daily life as they interacted with the Canaanites and other cultures around them. And just very briefly, to give some examples of that, I mentioned Genesis 1:16, the creation of the 2 great lights. I spent a year immersing myself in ancient Babylonian culture as part of my PhD thesis, which was on the imagery and prophecies of the book of Daniel. And I suddenly found myself asking the question, nothing to do with my PhD project, why in Genesis 1 does it say the 2 great lights and not the sun and the moon? And the answer is blindingly obvious once you immerse in ancient Egyptian culture, because the words for sun and moon in all the languages of that fertile crescent are the names of two of the major gods, the sun god and the moon god. And therefore, to say, our God made two great oil lamps and put them in the sky to help you tell the time, is a great put down for the ideas of the people around them, who said, oh no, they're great gods and we have to kowtow to them and make sure we appease them because they affect the way we live. It's a theological point that's being made, not an astronomical point. It's about astrology. It's an attack on polytheism and particularly astrology. It's not about astronomy. Genesis 1:21. I mentioned the verb bara, which is used in Genesis 1. It's a verb that's only ever used in the Old Testament in the active form with God as the subject. God baras things, usually translated create. And it occurs at the start and the end of the story. In verse 1, God creates heaven and the earth. At the end in chapter 2, the end comes in chapter 2, verse 3. We get a flashback, and God created heaven and the earth. It's used of the creation of humans, where 3 times in parallel we're told God created human beings, male and female. It's used in only one other place in the story, verse 21. And God created the great sea monsters. Why is it used there? Are we missing out on the whole theology of the whale that as Jews and Christians we should have taken very seriously? No, I hope you've got the answer already. It's because that's a swipe at the idea of chaos monsters, with which the Creator had to do battle. He didn't have to do battle with chaos monsters. If there are any monsters in the waters, Yahweh, the God of Israel, created them. And there's that wonderful psalm, Psalm 104, which is a creation psalm that in many ways parallels Genesis 1. And in it you've got the statement about, as the psalmist wonders about the sea, he says that in the sea you put Leviathan to play around. As if Leviathan has got pecked on fish. It's a put down on polytheism and the idea of chaos monsters. People have said Babylonian religion was one of the most anxiety-ridden religions there's ever been, because they were frightened that chaos would break in again. They might have to leave the Euro system. And it is saying, no, as ancient Hebrews, as worshippers of the God of Israel, we don't have that worry. There are no chaos monsters that are beyond the control of our God. You get that at the end of Job as well, with Behemoth and Leviathan. And then there's what it says about humans. I'm not talking about that now because my time's just about run out, but I will be picking that up on Wednesday when we talk about Genesis 2 and 3. But just to say, the picture given of the nature and role of humans in Genesis 1 is poles apart from the picture that you get in the other creation stories, where humans are presented as simply the downtrodden slaves of the gods. Genesis 1 is very different. As we heard from Alistair, humans are made in the image and likeness of God to look after and take care of God's world. Yes, in one sense under God, but not as God's slave, but as God's co-workers. A very high calling that we have in the world. So, I hope I have shown you and I hope convinced you that it's important to have this extra biblical evidence, to understand the cultural milieu in which the story was given, in order to see what its purpose is and what its message is. Of course, down through history, Jews and Christians have got very important theological messages out of Genesis 1. If you like, the basic theology is there for anyone who reads it with a little bit of common sense, as Calvin would put it. But the more you know about the cultural context, the greater depths and sharper points that you see in the story, and you realise it is just as relevant today as it was 3,000 years ago. How many people, when they open their newspapers, certainly in Britain this morning, the first thing they will turn to is their horoscope? Well, Genesis 1:16 addresses that, just as it did 3,000 years ago. And science is relevant here, because science has shown us even more what Maimonides said is true, what Origen said is true. If you try to read this passage literally, it leads to absurdity. Because, yes, if you insist it's read literally, you're back on the horns of that dilemma that we've had talked about already. Dawkins saying Genesis 1 is an alternative scientific account of creation is clearly rubbish. Some very conservative Christians saying Genesis 1 is to be read as a scientific theory and therefore all of modern science is rubbish. And you're caught with that dilemma. I'm suggesting to you that both of those are, in fact, old hat, enlightenment, wrong ways of reading the text, taken as a literal prose when it is figurative prose. Thank you.
Well, I'll say something in defence of Dawkins here. I would say it's not just that he doesn't think the literal interpretation makes sense, but he would also say the theological interpretation doesn't make sense either. So, for example, he would say that it talks about being a heaven and earth being fit for purpose, but that's only talking about the Neolithic period of man. So, for example, 100,000 years before, man had to go through an extreme ice age, which was extremely unfit for man's purpose. So that's my point.
Yeah, I mean, I was picking up on what he has actually said in terms of treating this as scientific text, if you like, scientific theory. I think I'd respond to what you said. It depends what you mean by what the purpose of God is. I mean, Simon Conway-Morris will be talking to us later in the week, and he would argue, if I understand it right, from having heard his lecture and reading his books, that that the history, the evolutionary history of this planet led, to use his terms, almost inevitably to rational creatures such as human beings, and maybe such things as the Ice Age and other happenings in the history of planet Earth were in fact fit for purpose because they were part of the process which the Creator used to bring into being rational creatures who could have the kind of relationship with him, with her, which Alistair talked about. So it depends on how you determine, how you define purpose.
Fair enough, yeah.
Okay, yes.
Thank you, Doctor. Just wanted to know that Leviathan has been mentioned in the Bible, and then also in ancient Near East text all. Did science has ever able to find out the fossils or something like this type of animal which is being mentioned? Can you just throw some light on that?
I would say that's an inappropriate question, because neither the Ugaritic text, nor Genesis 1, or Psalm 74, or Job, etc., is a scientific text. I don't think it's talking about, physical creatures. I think we need to change our mindset when we read these texts. It seems to me increasingly, both in the study, I don't like the word myth, but it's used by academic scholars and troubles that all have different, definitions of it. But in creation stories, which use the kind of imagery like about Tiamat and Rahab and Leviathan and so on, I think we have their way, the ancient Near Eastern people's way of doing what we would call philosophy. They are trying to grapple with the big questions of life. Why is the world the way it is? Why are we here? What is our purpose? And so on. And they do it by telling stories. And I'm not sure that we're right to assume that they took these stories literally. It is their way of visualizing questions and debating questions. I feel like it's like Plato's Timaeus, where he tells a creation story, but I don't think he ever believed that this was how things actually happened. It's a way of helping you think through an issue. So I think it would be inappropriate to look for fossils of Leviathan or Rahab.
In addition to this, a few days back, I was reading some newspaper and there was some article, and there's a photograph of a serpent with seven heads that was found in Kerala in India.
Right.
So, and then in Indian tradition also, we talk about serpents with so many heads. And now in ancient Near East text also they are mentioning. And
yeah, that's a good point. And I think what that might point to is that the kind of symbolism or imagery that's used by the poets, the Hebrew poets and Mesopotamian or Canaanite poets, is drawn, of course, from their experience. And it may be that the kind of imagery they're using is somehow related to creatures that they knew of in some way or other, whether it was actually live creatures or whether it was fossils. I mean, there's talk, the national symbol of Wales, who may mention the place where I live at the moment, is a dragon, and some people relate that to fossils of dinosaurs that are found in Wales, or it might be related to the Roman legions using certain standards. One of the Roman legions apparently had a dragon as its standard. They didn't know. So, there's a big PhD topic there for you. Why is a red dragon the symbol of Wales? But it may well be that the imagery is drawn from or related to fearsome creatures that they knew, or mixtures of creatures that they knew. I think what I know about Babylonian imagery, I think often the fearsome creatures are mixtures of creatures that they know.
So we'll go here and then we'll go to the back.
I wonder if we should ask the question whether the Jewish creation story was written or composed in order to justify the practice of the Sabbath, the 7-day order of Jewish life. Now, I don't know how that would connect with how we could find out how old the story of Genesis is and how it would relate to the formation of that practice. So,
well, it's clear that in the form that we have it, part of its purpose, as I said, is to set up a rhythm of work and rest, and that rhythm is 6 days work, 1 day's rest. So yes, it is related to giving importance to the Sabbath. That's part of the way God has made this world and made humans to live in this world. I don't think that that fulfills all of its meaning, or that in any way invalidates other aspects of meaning, but it's part of its meaning, yes. As to what does it say about the date of it, I'm not sure, because I don't think we have enough evidence from outside the Hebrew Scriptures as to quite when the Sabbath, the 1 in 7 pattern, became instantiated in Hebrew culture. It's not paralleled in other ancient Near Eastern cultures, which tend to be more related to either the new moon or the full moon. So it tends to be a 14 or 15 day pattern.
Thank you very much. A very, very, very educative piece of understanding within the book of Genesis. I'm called Francis once again, and as a water engineer, through my time in school and learning the theoretical science, and now applying it for more than 10 years, I came to learn in class that for you to determine groundwater, you need to use some geophysics approach. And when I went down to the field, I discovered there are actually people that are able to do that even without applying my geophysics. Our books in science tell us they use 70% accuracy when you're using the best tools in geophysics. But when you go down to the ground, there are guys using traditional methods that have nearly the same level of accuracy, though it's not proven. And then reading in Genesis, I discovered that Abraham and Jacob and Isaac had a way to determine wells and drill wells that lived way up to the time when Jesus met this lady at the well. So what we're trying to say in this is that my understanding from the morning discussion and now is that it's impossible for us to begin to correlate religion within science by just reading how scripture is written for the understanding of people by that time. But we should have the big understanding that actually religion, or what some people call faith, is much broader than the limitation of science. Science is just a method, a way for us to understand what is there, and perhaps provide models of understanding. But what we have as faith and religion is only a limited scope of what God has given us. But us in being, we are a representative of the larger creature, the larger creation of God, but is much bigger than what we can write on paper or what we can present in picture. So I'm so happy to hear that very elaborate description. I'm very excited because I wanted to hear this all along. When I saw the drawing of Michelangelo representing God creating Adam, it was limited but trying to show a presentation in his mind of understanding. And therefore knowing also that some text of the Bible, which has been criticized by scientists, sometimes is limited in scope to the same extent. So just in a nutshell, I'm just here to say with all I have seen, with all the work I've seen, both with the scientists and the people who have never been to a classroom, there is a bigger understanding of God that can never be limited in a laboratory.
Well, thank you. I fully take that on this point. What you might be pointing to is that maybe part of our being made in the image of God and for the purpose and role that Genesis 1 says, that there is the possibility of an empathy between humans and the non-human creation, and even perhaps the non-sentient creation, that we have, certainly in the West, lost to a degree. And maybe as you live more independence in the knowledge of God, it might help to bring us back into a more empathetic relationship with the rest of creation. And the sort of thing that you referred to in terms of knowing where the groundwater is might be an element of that. I don't know, that's pure speculation.
You said in the beginning of your lecture that you talked with creationists for 40 years now. And my question would be, how do they react to such a presentation? Would you certainly vote for them?
Good question. Some totally reject it. I mean, there is one comment, I think it's written by Henry Morris. Those in the Christian tradition will know the book of perhaps the Genesis Flood by Warwick Morris. Henry Morris, one of those authors, says, well, God's quite capable of saying what he means, quite plainly. In fact, I think he is saying, I'm assuming God must have written it literally. Somehow, you know. So there are some who respond like that. There are some who respond, well, now that's very interesting. I've never thought about it that way before. And go away and think about it. And again, the feedback I sometimes get is it's changed their minds. And there are others for whom it is like a blinding light. Suddenly, there's almost like an overnight conversion. Of course that's how we ought to read it. So there's a whole range from total rejection through to taking it on board quite quickly. I wouldn't like to try and estimate what the what the response is, because I've never done a systematic study of that. That's the kind of, it gets the whole range of response.
I think there's a question here. Yes.
About 40 years ago, R.K. Harrison rather famously interpreted the first 11 chapters of Genesis as a patchwork quilt of Akkadian, very ancient Akkadian cuneiform tablets, so that Moses was not the writer but the editor of the documents. Could you tell me how you feel about that, and if you would agree with Harrison, can you see any developmental aspect of Moses shaping the material that was very ancient when he got it?
I respect R.K. Harrison. I cut my teeth on R.K. Harrison in some ways in Old Testament studies. I'm not sure I'd put it the way he did. I don't see it as a patchwork quilt. I see it, as I said, using imagery from the ancient Near East that we find in fact, I think it's more in Canaanite probably texts rather than Akkadian texts, so we only have a limited corpus of Canaanite texts. So I said this is incarnation, God using the imagery that's in the writer's mind to express the theological truth. But in so many ways, it is poles apart from the creation stories of Assyria and Babylon and Egypt, which are the ones that we know best. So it's more, it's a totally different structure and so on from those stories, but clearly it seems to me alluding to those stories and using similar imagery and picking up and responding in a negative way to some of the ideas and imagery.
If I may just bring another example of what you were saying, there's a famous, Aesop's fables are very famous, especially the fox and the grapes. No one thinks it's speaking about foxes, and not speaking about grapes, and it's not speaking about talking foxes. It's speaking about an important aspect of human behavior, garbed in the example of the thing of the fox and the grapes, which is exactly what you're saying about.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. We do tend sometimes to forget. I think it's a result of the Enlightenment, perhaps, that the figurative use of language was far more. It's interesting, trying to remember his name is Hobbes, who wrote Leviathan, interestingly, a book called Leviathan. Hobbes, which some of you, if you've got a background in European philosophy and thought, Hobbes, writing, interestingly, if I'm right, in the 17th, 18th century, is suddenly suspicious about the use of metaphor, because he thinks metaphor is lying, because metaphor is using an imagery to say something other than a literal interpretation. To me, that's the beginning, you're into the impact of a more literalistic mindset in Europe because of the rise of science. I think we've got to get back beyond that.
I think we'd use a good chunk of the English language as
We
well.
would. And English.
Okay, so more questions. Hands up, yes, here and here.
Hi, yeah, thanks. Firstly, I want to caveat this, but I completely agree with the figurative kind of interpretation you've said about. But in Genesis, would it be fair to say that there's a mixture? Because when you might touch on this on a later talk, but when you introduce Noah and you introduce Abraham, Joseph ending up in Egypt, why then is that in one book, I guess, when it's different genres, different types of text, and how do we interpret that?
Yeah, I will be coming back to that in the next lecture, but to answer very briefly, it's not unusual to have more than one genre in a book. It's common in the Hebrew scriptures that you get mixed genres in one book. Quite why certain, because to use the term book is an anachronistic term. They work with scrolls, and there was a limit as to what first of all, it was expensive to produce scrolls, so you put as much as you could on your scroll, and there was a limit to how practically big a scroll could be, so that's what tends to limit it to some degree. So I think we get a genre change at the end of chapter 11 in Genesis, when you have the introduction of Terah and Abraham, and I think that even in English translation that's recognisable. But with what we know about the history and culture of the ancient Near East, you can see that from the end of Genesis 11 onwards, we're in a recognisable fertile crescent that we know about from archaeology, whereas before that we are not. We seem to be in a symbolic universe, if you like, up to that point, and then we get a switch to a recognisable world that we know about from the history, the geography, the agriculture, and so on, as it's talked about.
During what time period was this Genesis account written? I've heard that it's attributed to Moses, but it was written during the Babylonian exile.
Good question that you've asked there. I think, first of all, again, we've got to recognise that the question of authorship is a very modern one. It's related to, I think, the printing press, and then to patent law, and so on. And we have an attitude to authorship that I think is very modern. I mean, can't read that back into the ancient world. Genesis 1, as we have it, I suspect, is something that came into being over an order of time. I mentioned Psalm 104. I suspect that's an older way of talking about the creation story than we have in Genesis 1, but it's very similar in many ways. The order of events and so on is the same. So I think we're back into the question about oral tradition and when does that crystallise in written form, which we can't really answer, I don't think. I think in the form we have it, Genesis 1 seems to me, and I think this would be true of most Old Testament scholars, it seems to be so well honed to respond to the probably the kind of issues and questions that would come home in a stronger way to the Judeans when they're in exile in Babylon than they had to have before, though they would have met it, as I said, in talking to their Canaanite neighbours and so on. But maybe that is the point where it crystallises in quite the form we have it. And we know how important things like the Sabbath and the food laws and so on, which have been there before, but they become important ethnic and religious markers once you're exiles in a foreign land and you've got to separate yourself from the other people. So that may be the context in which it takes the form we have it now. But what I'm saying is how literature, or how things came to take a particular literary form was different in the ancient world than where we nowadays expect authors to sit down, do their research, and then write a text.
I wonder if you can say anything about Genesis 1:1 in the beginning. If it, I don't know any Hebrew, but I know there is like an academic debate about this word tohu babohu, something like that. I'm not sure. Is it something or is it nothing? I come from a Catholic background, and I have always had trouble with the creatio ex nihilo doctrine, because I think that, well, I want you to say something about it.
Yeah, I'm going to deflect that question to myself on Wednesday. I will pick that up on Wednesday. I don't want to. I have time then. I've timed it into my presentation on Wednesday, so I'll do it more justice. If I don't do it enough justice for you, you have a chance to ask further questions about that on Wednesday.
I've just been reflecting on what you were saying about chaos, and if I understand you correctly, you were saying that Marduk slayed the forces of chaos, is that right?
Yes.
And that the Hebrew scriptures take beyond that and saying Yahweh, or the right word is there, was in charge of the whole of creation, and therefore this issue about chaos is actually really quite important, and because chaos is present in all our lives to some extent, and I suspect within the Jewish perceptions as well. I just wonder whether you sort of comment about how they dealt with these notions of chaos as things are being developed.
Right, well, that's a very, very important question. I think first of all I'd say that, some people say you've got chaos there in Genesis 1, you've got the waters with a mighty wind blowing across them. I don't think that's chaos, I think that's unformedness in Genesis 1. Because chaos in Babylon and probably in Ugaritic text is something negative and evil. I don't think we've got that in Genesis 1, we've just got unformedness that then has to be shaped. And where chaos comes in, it seems to me, in the Hebrew scriptures, is more to do with Genesis 3 and human rebellion against their creator. And that's where the issue of chaos, particularly in the form later on of suffering, comes in. So I think it's a different way of dealing with it. So it seems to me, I'm not an expert in ancient Near Eastern religion, but it seems to me that there so much will be explained by simply saying, well, it's chaotic and we can't do anything about it. Whereas in the Hebrew tradition, it is saying, yes, there are big problems of suffering and of evil and of things we can't explain and understand, but we do believe that somehow our God is in control and somehow can use these, through these, still bring about the purposes that he has for his world. So it's a different framework of looking at why is this world so messy and why are there so many problems. It's still a big problem, as the book of Job shows. There's no simple answer in the Hebrew Bible or indeed in the New Testament, I don't think, to these questions, except saying you can trust the Creator ultimately, even though you cannot understand what's going on.